This is the fourth week of what will be 6 in our Lent 2021 series, Your Home Spiritual Workout, which is focused on biblical and historical spiritual habits or practices or routines for you to try out in your own life. So let me explain the why behind this series with an image and a quote. So the image is the one on the bottom right. And forgive me for any of you for whom this brings back memories of a bathroom remodel gone totally wrong. But I want you to keep that image in mind and listen to this quote. This is from C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, quote, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised by them. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and doesn't seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards, and so on. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace in which he intends to come and live." This is a series about remodeling, refurbishing, a redo. And it's about you, and it's about me. And the way that God rebuilds the house of your life in which he intends to dwell is he does it through your spiritual practices. That's the why behind what we're doing. So today, let's begin here. There's a 20th century English actor and comedian by the name of Norman Wisbon, and he once quipped, "As you get older, 3 things happen. The first is that your memory goes, and I can't remember the other 2. Regardless of your age, be you 20 or 50 or 80, what you're going to find is that time is the thief of memory." Let's dig into that a little bit. 2 weeks ago, what were your greatest joys? 2 weeks ago, by the way, is the last week of February. What were your greatest joys? What did you struggle with that week? What were your biggest successes, however we define them? And what were your biggest setbacks, however we define them? How much of your life do you remember from just 2 weeks ago? Now let's push the envelope backward more. 10 years ago, how were you changing spiritually? How were you struggling spiritually? What were the key lessons that God was teaching you or your family that you felt like at the time were priceless treasures to you? See, when you look that far backward, what you realize is that what most of us do when we think of the past is we just project our present onto the past. For example, all of us over the age of 20 were at some point a teenager. But what you cannot remember is what the experience was like being a teenager at the time. When I, as a 51-year-old dad to 2 teenagers, look back at me being an adolescent, what I'm really doing is projecting my present back onto my experience as a teenager. And I think to myself, All these ways that I have grown up or gotten wiser, hopefully, over the years, now I look back and think, well, I see that now in me, at least in some form as a teenager. And what I've forgotten is know what it's like to actually be a teenager when you're a teenager. This, by the way, explains so much of the tension between the generations. How much of your life did you swear you would never forget? And you have. How many days, weeks, months, and even years are now resigned to the oblivion of the past? Erased from your memory. As if it didn't really happen. I'm 51 years old, and yet it sure does seem like in actuality my life is a lot shorter. Because I remember so little of it. Is that true of you too? The great American writer Cormac McCarthy said, "We forget the things we want to remember, and we remember the things we want to forget." I'd like you to consider two sets of verses from the Old Testament. Here's the first. These three selections come from three different eras of Israel's history. First, this is Deuteronomy 4:9. "But take care and watch yourselves closely, so that you neither forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and to your children's children." I did a rough approximation this week, and Deuteronomy contains no less than 12 passages that sound something like that. What are the things that Deuteronomy is saying that God's people in that moment need to remember? Well, they need to remember the Exodus, God freeing them from Egypt, their failure to enter the Promised Land the first time, their 40-year sojourn around the Sinai Peninsula. Those are the historical precedents to that verse. And the writer of Deuteronomy says, please don't forget. So much so, in fact, you need to pass this on to your children and to your grandchildren. So powerful and consequential were these events and lessons in your life as God's people. Now move forward a little bit in Israel's history. This comes after the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua. This is from Judges. All of the narrative of Judges, the book of Judges, is driven by the back and forth rhythm you see here in chapter 8, verse 34. As soon as Gideon died, Israel were unfaithful and took Baal as their god. And the Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. The back and the forth from Israel remembering God and then forgetting Him and choosing other gods. As you move forward into Israel's history, this is what defines the era of the kings. David, Solomon, and those after. And then we get to the prophets. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 32. Can an engaged young woman forget her wedding ring, or a bride her wedding attire? And yet my people have forgotten me for days without number. As a pastor, I've probably had opportunity to officiate, somewhere between 30 and 40 weddings now. There is no greater panic than when the wedding dress does not arrive on time, or when the ring bearer or some other adult has lost the wedding rings. And yet, Jeremiah the prophet says, this is kind of how remarkable and ironic it is that God's people so often can just forget Him. So what you see in the Old Testament, really throughout the history, from end to end of God's people, Israel, is that whatever else they are, they're forgetful. So, what's the antidote? Consider these selections from the Psalms of the Old Testament. Psalm 42, verse 4. King David writing, "These things I remember as I pour out my soul. how I went with the throng and led them in the procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Remember the times of great corporate worship, what it was like to be united in heart and purpose and intent, to remember the praise, the worship, and the learning together, David says. Psalm 105, verses 4 and 5, seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works he has done, his miracles, and the pronouncements he has uttered. Remember what he has done, his works, and remember what he has said, his words, the psalmist says. In Psalm 143, verses 5 and 6, I remember the days of old. I think about all your deeds. I meditate on the works of your hands. I stretch out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. There's an interesting dynamic to that last selection. The more that we remember what God has done and said in the past, the more we yearn for him in the present. It's as if our past satisfaction with him drives our present thirst for him. Remembering, apparently, is a kind of spiritual propellant in our lives. It is not merely that we attach back to who God has been and how he has shaped us in the past. By doing so, it pushes us into the present and the future, longing for more of the same. What are the lessons here from the wisdom of the Old Testament? Number one is this: God's people have always been forgetful. And the antidote to that forgetfulness is intentional remembering. Before we talk about how you and I can do that in our lives, I want to talk for a moment about what we now know about remembering in the field of neuroscience. How is it that you and I remember some things and not so many others? Why do some things linger with us or make a mark, and so many others don't? Well, here's what memory scientists would tell you. Number one, if you want to remember something, you have to encode it. That's their word. What does it mean to encode an experience or a lesson? It means you have to relish it. You have to pause. In the language of the Psalms of the Old Testament, you have to take a selah with whatever it is you're trying to remember. Neuroscientists would tell you that you have to linger on something you want to remember a minimum of 30 seconds. And the more over 30 seconds you do it, the more likely it is that it's going to stick. But specifically, you need to linger on the details of what you're trying to remember. You need to think of an image that was either part of what you want to remember or somehow is associated with it for you. You need to linger on how what you experienced was new for you. Not the same as what you've experienced before, but new. How did that newness feel? Perhaps when you first encountered a new friend or a new idea that rocked your world and grabbed your soul. Remember the newness. And most of all, the single most important thing you have to do if you want to remember anything in your life is you have got to remember how you feel at the moment of the experience that you want to remember. When it comes to the substantial things of life, the lessons, the people, the encounters, the experiences that we want to remember, you remember the things you feel. You don't remember facts. How did you feel when that happened? Relish it. Pause and linger with it. And there's a far better chance you'll remember it. You also need to associate. That means you need to consider how all of your past before today somehow intersects with what it is that you want to remember. So again, let's say you had an experience that was totally out of left field for you. It was new, it was jarring, but it was exhilarating. You need to think about why that's true. What about your past made that experience so exhilarating for you? You have to associate your present with the past in order to remember it. By the way, we as human beings do this all the time unconsciously anyway. When you have a conversation with somebody, you're not really having a conversation with them, at least not in part. You're having a conversation with all the baggage that they've drawn into that conversation with you. All their past experiences, their hurts and frustrations that have shaped who they are, that is who you're having the conversation with. We do association involuntarily and unconsciously. But in order to remember the things that we want to, we have to do it consciously. And last, you don't get to pick what happens to you, but you do get to pick the meaning of what happens to you. And if you want to remember something, you have got to assign it meaning. There's a neuroscientist who says it this way: yourself, the entirety of who you are, yourself is created by your memories. And your memories are created by your mental habits. If you want to be God's person, God's child, who doesn't forget and who remembers deliberately, these are going to be keys for you to do it. Now, what are some of the spiritual habits or disciplines that will help you be a person who remembers? If you will, how are you going to remember to remember? Now, we've actually in this series talked about a couple of spiritual routines that might help with it. Like, for example, last week we talked about fixed hour prayer, or praying the hours. Well, if you pause 3 times a day to pray, even if just short, part of what you're doing is remembering. You're not forgetting. You're bringing yourself back to center and to God, who is your life. But here are 3 more you can consider weaving into your personal relationship with God as an act of active remembering. The first is what you might call a life review. Historically speaking, the item that the Christians have used the most to do this comes from the 1500s, and it's called the Examen, created by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And it's a very small set of questions that sometime toward the end of your day, you just ask. Maybe laying there on your bed before you go to sleep. Maybe after the kids go to bed, you pull out your journal, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you go through these questions together. You have coffee with a friend, and you work through these questions together as an act of spiritual remembering. And the questions are simple, like, where today did I see God or encounter Him? Where today did I cooperate with God, and where did I resist Him? What am I thankful for about today? Not what am I thankful for 10 years ago? Not what am I thankful for from last week? No, just today, in the last 24 hours, what am I thankful for? And how, if in any way, do I feel like God is calling me to change or to act based on what I've experienced today? There are Christians who do this every day at the end of the day. I want you to know I've never successfully been able to do that. But I will tell you I do this twice a week. And in fact, the best adult friendship I've ever been able to form in my life was based on doing this together once a month. Looking back over the month between our meetings, and we would just do this. And it was life-changing. So perhaps what you could consider doing this week, and don't worry about the details, you'll get the details in tomorrow's Monday email. Maybe what you could consider doing once or twice this week is pausing toward the end of the day, or when you have a moment of quiet, and look back over the last couple of days and just ask God those questions. And let Him bring to mind what it is that He wants you to see and what He wants you to remember. Now, related to number one can be number two, which is a kind of journaling. Now, some people, understandably, are put off by the idea of journaling because they don't consider themselves a writer. And I get it. But what if you could make journaling far more simple, where you don't have to be a professional poet or novelist to do it? You can consider something called bullet journaling, where all you do is write down single phrases, sentences, or paragraphs that maybe answer some of those examine questions over the day. And you focus on what you know will help you remember. You focus on the details of the experience you want to remember. You focus on the emotion of what the encounter felt like. You focus on the newness of what happened to you, so that you can have a written record of how it is that you and God are traveling through every hour of your life together. Don't beat yourself up. Don't do it every day if that doesn't fit you. I don't. But I have 2 journals that I keep, and I enter in them at least once a week. One has to do with my life as a pastor. One has to do with my life as a disciple of Jesus. And now, because of that practice, I have a record of my journey with God and what it's been like to be His child now for 50 some odd years. Maybe this week you could try, at least once, doing a little bullet journaling, maybe using the examine questions as a way of keeping a record of what you want to remember. Last, there's a practice in the Old Testament that's called memory stones. You first encounter it in Joshua chapter 4, verses 5 to 9. This is when Israel, right after the time of Moses and Deuteronomy, crosses the Jordan River to take possession of the promised land. And in these verses, Joshua tells one person per tribe, when you are in the middle of the river crossing, bend over and pick up a polished, smooth river stone. And then when you get to the other side, build an altar with those stones, so that when your grandchildren wander by this spot, there will be a visual reminder of what happened here. What you find out as you go forward in the Old Testament is that all these altars that were built of stones from places where significant events happened in the life of Israel, they were all moved to one place. My daughter is named for that place, Shiloh. And it became a museum, a testament to God's faithfulness. All these altars were at Shiloh, so that the memories of God and His people could be kept. What's a memory stone? It is a physical object that reminds you of a spiritual experience or lesson. In the Shearer household, Heather and I share this spiritual discipline. In fact, if my wife were here, I am 110% confident she could tell you exactly where she and I learned this spiritual habit first. And it was in the 3rd year of our marriage at a church in Tucson, Arizona, and the pastor taught that day about memory stones. And so we have lived our entire married life collecting physical objects that are cues or triggers about spiritual experiences or lessons that we want to remember. Let me make it concrete for you. Here are some from my office, just back over there beyond the sanctuary. On the wall above my desk in my office are those pictures on the left. Some of them are of churches I have pastored in the past. The drawing that's hard to make out on the upper right of that left picture is the first place I was a pastor. And that's one of the dormitories at the seminary where I was a chaplain. And it hangs there so I can remember. On my desk, this is the picture on the bottom. You see there's a little statue of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. I was given that by my second church as a reminder of my call to be a shepherd or pastor like Jesus. There's a woman in the bottom right picture, an older woman. That is my Grandma Betty. My Grandma Betty would be what I would call in my spiritual life my spiritual precursor. She's my spiritual precedent. I didn't know it at the time when I was a young man, but she is the Christian that I wanted to become. And lo and behold, in some small way, I have. Do you know I wear one? I wear a wedding ring like most of us who are married, but on my other hand, every day I wear another ring. And it's changed over the years as my fingers have grown and shrank depending on the year. This is my ordination ring. The day that I was ordained in my service, I was given a ring to remember the commitment that I made to be a God-honoring pastor of grace, love, and character. And I wear this to see it so that I'll remember those commitments. You need memory stones too. You need memory stones that are going to be physical cues of experiences, encounters, and lessons that you hope to hang on to and not forget. I want to end today with two quotes that are true of the role of remembering in your life as a Christian. First comes from the great Colombian writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Life is not what one has lived, but what one remembers, and how one remembers it in order to recount it. And then in a wonderful metaphor, the great Russian philosopher and social critic Alexander Solzhenitsyn says very simply that you and I need to realize that our memories are our spiritual traveling bags. Maybe you and I can spend the week trying to pack some memories and experiences into the luggage that we're going to take with us into the rest of our years on earth, traveling with Christ. Your memories are your spiritual traveling bags.